Hello, everyone. Welcome to our midweek Bible study here, the third week of this series. The first week we looked at the Gospel of Mark, and then last week we took a look at the Gospel of Matthew. So this brings us to the third in our series, the Gospel of Luke. So let's switch over, and I will start this up now. Mark and Matthew, we'll start out with the author. And just like those first two Gospels, the author is anonymous, never identifies him or herself. All right, but we do know that the same person who wrote the Gospel of Luke also wrote the book of Acts. And so you can think of Luke and Acts as a two-volume set. Okay, Acts is volume 2 of the Gospel of Luke. So if we continue this series and I start talking about the book of Acts, a lot of these notes on style and language and themes will also apply there. All right, if you are studying through the book of Acts, you can take a look at this study and think about what you're learning there in Acts. Now, although this work was written anonymously, early on in church history and tradition, it became identified with Luke, okay, this companion of Paul, who is addressed as the beloved physician in Colossians chapter 4, verse 14, and then mentioned again in Philemon, verse 24. Now, although we don't know who wrote Luke and Acts, we do know that it was dedicated to a person, most excellent Theophilus, mentioned in chapter 1, verse 3 of Luke. Now, this is probably a wealthy patron who commissioned the writing of the volumes, this person, Theophilus. Or maybe it was an influencer or an official who was sympathetic to the Christian community, and Luke wanted to present this account of the life of this person, Jesus, who was so important to this community. Now, there's also the possibility that this wasn't a person at all. All right, it sure looks like a name, Theophilus, but this name Theophilus, literally it means friend of God. So this dedication, it has been suggested, may have been to anyone who is just pursuing a knowledge of God. Okay, so whatever the case, Luke gives us some insight into the writing of this book. And from here on out, I will just address the author of this book as Luke, because of how it's become titled in our English Bibles. All right, so Luke starts out in chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, and I'll just read it here. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. All right, so there is the intro to Luke's Gospel. And I wanted to spend some time here because I think most of the time we would just skim right past this part and get on to the meat of the story. But there's some very important and interesting information here, at least I think so. Maybe nobody else does. But I noticed that first Luke says that many have undertaken to record the words and deeds of Jesus. Okay, so think about this. We do know that Luke seems to have had access to Mark, in a similar way to Matthew. There's a lot of Mark's gospel that is contained in Luke, and some of these passages that they have in common are almost identical. However, here in chapter 1, verse 1, Luke said that many have undertaken to write accounts. Okay, many have undertaken. I mean, this suggests to me that there were other gospel accounts, other stories of Jesus kind of floating around at this time. All right. Now, there are ideas that relate to this, but I'm actually going to save that discussion for next week. Next week, I want to take a break. We're not going to actually cover the Gospel of John next week, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how we think these first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, came about, and some theories on how they were written and kind of the behind-the-scenes stuff, because it's pretty interesting, at least it is to me. So the other thing that I wanted to highlight from this intro to Luke, okay, first of all, yeah, there's like other gospels, other stories of Jesus kind of floating around. And secondly, I noticed that there are several channels for biblical inspiration. All right, typically we might think we've been taught about the Bible either coming directly from God. God speaks through someone like the Hebrew prophets, okay, or else maybe the Holy Spirit puts thoughts into someone's mind and then they write them down or have somebody else record them, like the letters of Paul. Okay, and a lot of the Bible seems to have been written that way. But here in the intro to Luke, Luke says that he investigated everything carefully to produce an orderly account of events. So to me this says that scholarly research is one way that God inspired people to write the Bible. It wasn't just one person sort of getting taken over by the Spirit. Okay, it may have been a lot of people whose works were never officially included in the Bible, but maybe Luke went out and got, pieces of writings here, pieces there, some stories, eyewitness accounts, and kind of put them all together, of course, under the direction then of the Holy Spirit. So just another way that maybe inspiration of the Bible works. Okay, just a kind of an interesting view of how the Bible worked and how God worked through people. It seems like God used a number of ways to produce this book that we call now the Bible. I said in a previous video that looking at the language of the Gospels, first Mark, of course, is kind of rushed, sort of simple, okay, interested in this immediate impact and kind of putting you right in the action. Matthew's gospel, very much in contrast. Matthew is very deliberate. Matthew writes with an absolute dedication to this overall purpose. Okay, almost like an accountant. Numbers are important. Scriptural references are important. We're going to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus is the Messiah to the Jewish people. Okay, very meticulous and detailed in pursuing that goal. Now, how is Luke written? Well, you read through Luke in English and you can see this, but even more in the Greek. Okay, Luke is written in a very elevated, almost elegant style. This book, along with the volume 2, the book of Acts, comprise the most sophisticated Greek in the New Testament. Okay, completely in contrast with Mark, which is, as I've mentioned before, it's kind of the bane of Greek students who are just learning the language, because Mark is just super rushed and sometimes doesn't care about grammatical rules and things. Well, Luke is not like that at all. Okay, Luke wants you to know that he's writing this in a very elevated, almost like academic style. Now, not only is the style elegant, it seems to have been written in a way to deliberately evoke the language of the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. And interestingly enough, a lot of the New Testament works that quote from the Hebrew Bible are quoting from the Septuagint, not from the Hebrew. Okay, but Luke wanted readers to immediately associate his work with kind of what they had been exposed to as holy and religious language. All right, maybe a similar modern day example would be if I said something like, "Thou hast begotten us to do thy will. The firmament declares thy mighty works." Okay, even if I don't preface it with something like "Dear God" at the beginning, most people, if you heard me talking like that, if I said that, most people would probably assume that this is a prayer, right? And that this was kind of addressed to God. Nobody talks like this now, and I was speaking in a way that it was a deliberate callback to the King James Bible, right? Thou hast begotten us to do thy will. Okay, at the very least, it's recognized as kind of religious language, church language. And it seems that was kind of the effect that Luke was going for. But it's not just the language that is elevated and religious. Luke's gospel is very interested in worship, specifically prayer. A lot of people are portrayed as being in prayer. The opening and closing scenes of this gospel, I've put the scriptural references there if you want to look them up. But the opening and closing scenes of the book have people worshiping in the temple. Yeah, Zechariah at the beginning, and then the disciples after Jesus is taken up to heaven at the end. Luke contains more references to worship than any of the other gospels. In regards to prayer, Luke pictures Jesus praying more than the other Gospels, and Jesus is specifically mentioned praying at important times during his ministry. For example, during his baptism, his baptism happened like while he was praying, and then the Transfiguration, Jesus was also praying then. Some well-known parables teaching about prayer are unique to Luke's Gospel. Now, of particular interest to Mission Road Church, now, another theme with worship and prayer, food is also important. Any of you who have been to our church know that food is a big part of our church. We have a potluck every single week to sort of plug the church if you want to come and visit whenever this social distancing is over. All of our socials, pretty much all of our socials, all of our staff meetings are all surrounding around food, and food is a prominent topic in Luke. Specifically, Jesus is portrayed as having meals more often than any other gospel. And a particular criticism that Jesus gets from his opponents concerns what he eats. Not only what he eats, but also with whom he eats. And I'll be saying more about that later. Okay, so very much elegant language, religious language, and then themes around gathering and worshiping and praying and also meals. Okay, but not only is the language of Luke elegant and elevated, kind of the way that the gospel is put together is also very purposeful and also elegant is the best way to describe it. Okay, if Matthew was written with the soul of a teacher or an accountant, Luke is very much written with the soul of an artist. 5 times in the first 2 chapters, you'll have the story going along and action happens, and then characters will just burst into song. And a lot of your modern English translations will have that written sort of in a poetic way. Okay, they'll set the things off and have them written kind of in stanzas. A modern adaptation of the story of Jesus' birth from Luke could very well be imagined as a musical. Yeah, the spotlight comes on these people, and they just start singing about what's going on. I've put a slide here with the 5 songs there in Luke 1 and 2 and kind of the Latin names that have become associated with those songs. those of you who have any background in like classical music or choral music are probably familiar with a lot of these, right? Ave Maria, Magnificat, okay, Benedictus. These are these have been kind of the inspiration for a lot of our sacred and classical music. Okay? These songs that are in Luke, and another example of just kind of the artistry and the very deliberate, focused way that Luke wrote is that the themes in these songs are then echoed in the narrative of Luke. Okay, Luke's telling of the Jesus story um, kind of harkens back to these five songs in the beginning of the gospel. Okay, so this is a work that was put together to be like a grand operatic work. Okay, we've got artistic flourishes and dramatic swells, and when the story just kind of swells up to a crest, and people like start singing. Okay, many of the most potent, evocative liturgies, like church readings and sacred choral pieces, again, come from the Gospel of Luke. It's just an incredibly beautiful and elevated work, and yeah, of course I encourage everybody to read through these as we're going over this. But yeah, try and read through this, even just chapters 1 and 2, if you don't have a lot of time, and see how this is laid out, and how these songs presented by these characters really take over and drive these themes home. All right. Matthew uses about 90% of the material in Mark, whereas Luke only uses about 50% of Mark, and edits a lot of it, changes it, cleans up the language. But Luke is going to add a lot of material to this that is unique to his gospel. Apparently, Luke had a very rich source of information. And again, he states at the beginning that he's going to do this careful research. And so apparently he did a good job of that, because we have a lot of material that is unique to Luke. And also it includes some really important details from Jesus' life, that if we didn't have this gospel, we'd be missing a lot. Okay, you have the pre-birth narratives that have the characters of Zechariah, Elizabeth, and then Mary's the Annunciation to Mary, her visit to Elizabeth, and everything that goes on there. Okay, kind of behind the scenes leading up to Jesus' birth, and then the actual story of Jesus' birth. How they traveled to Bethlehem, everything that happened, and then the actual birth of Jesus. These stories only happen in Luke. Okay, the beginning of Jesus' ministry, his first sermon in Nazareth, where he quotes from Isaiah 61. Okay, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. This great and powerful first sermon where he actually gets driven out of the town and they want to throw him over a cliff. That is only in Luke. Then we have the post-resurrection stories. After Jesus' death and resurrection, we have these stories from after that, the walk to Emmaus, and then Jesus' ascension. If you remember in Mark, the story drops off of a cliff and just ends with the women running away from the tomb and not saying anything to anybody. Matthew kind of cleans that up and has everybody kind of meeting Jesus on the mountain. But Matthew closes with the Great Commission. Okay, Jesus sending them out into all of the world, and this promise that I am with you always. We don't actually get anything about Jesus ascending into heaven. That only happens in Luke in chapter 24 at the very end. Another thing that is only included in Luke's gospel are some of the most beloved parables of Jesus. Okay, I've put two of them up here, the Good Samaritan in chapter 10 and the Prodigal Son of chapter 15. Okay, so these very memorable and famous parables, but then also some of Jesus' most difficult parables come in Luke. The dishonest steward, one of Jesus' parables that probably a lot of people have never heard preached about. Um, and then the rich man and Lazarus, um, this really strange story that really challenges Adventists and kind of our vision of what happens after people die. Both of those parables, those difficult and strange parables, are also in Luke. Okay? So some of these stories and some of these teachings, uh, apparently Luke really took this research task seriously and kind of uncovered a lot of stories that only he knew about. Now let's get into the themes of Luke. Perhaps the most obvious theme of this gospel and what has made it such a beloved book to a lot of people throughout the ages is this obvious and extreme concern on the part of the writer for those on the margins. The outcasts, the oppressed, especially the poor, find a friend in Jesus. Along with the Epistle of James, Luke really takes up the mantle of the Hebrew prophets. Okay, Amos, Joel, Micah, Jeremiah, these prophets who really called people's attention to the plight of the poor when everybody else wants to look away and forget them and say, you know, you're cursed of God, you've been forgotten by everybody. These prophets kind of grab our faces and just turn our attention to the suffering of the poorest and the most vulnerable. And Luke takes up that mantle. Luke does the same thing. Luke focuses on Jesus's attitudes towards the poor. And Luke also asserts that God has his eye in a very special way on those people that society too often deems irrelevant and just replaceable, sort of disposable. All right, and that's a really important thing, you know, to our time, right? We have seen now this real stratification of people, you know, who are privileged, who can stay home and kind of shelter in place, and you know, the people who are kind of seen now as essential workers. These people, a lot of the times, are the folks who are in very insecure jobs, who are working for lousy pay, but you know, they're the ones who are being thrown out on the front lines of now this pandemic, and they're the ones who are risking getting sick. Luke would take note of that, and I think Luke would want us to take notice of that. And for those of us who study through Luke's gospel, we should keep this in mind. Okay, how is our society kind of organized to favor certain people and, you know, forget others? And Luke says, don't forget those people because God sure doesn't forget them. Luke's gospel specifically challenges prejudices, okay, against you know, racial prejudice against Samaritans, you know, sort of class prejudice. Tax collectors also figure prominently in Luke. Right, the story of Zacchaeus, the tax collector, is one that is only in Luke. Okay, and this tax collector is one whom Jesus takes special care for, and actually is redeemed in the end. So you know, yeah, these people who were not Jewish and were, you know, were kind of seen as the scum of the earth, you know, pushed to the margins. Luke's gospel really says you need to look at these people like people, and Jesus cares about them, and Jesus will go out of his way to notice them and care about them. Going back to the theme of food and meals, Jesus eats with these undesirables. Okay? Jesus does not seem particularly ashamed or shy about it when he's confronted by the religious leaders and the respectable people. Something that's, you know, really important and close to my heart. Women are important characters in Luke's gospel. In fact, it seems that for every prominent male character in the Jesus story that is introduced, either in the Jesus narrative or in Jesus' parables, there is a corresponding female character. For every man, there is a woman, and it's obvious that Luke is doing this on purpose. This balance is remarkable for the time that this work was written. And these women, these female characters, they're not tokens. Okay, they're not like unnamed women who are just kind of drifting around, operating in the background. No, Luke like takes these women and places them front and center in the narrative. Mary, the mother of Jesus, at the very beginning, I mean, she's singled out as this paragon of faithfulness. And in fact, her faithfulness and her love of the word comes like bursting out in this song that we call the Magnificat. Okay, and in chapter 1 there, she says, "My soul magnifies the Lord," and then she's like quoting the Old Testament. She's quoting from the Hebrew prophets, just spitting fire at the privileged and the comfortable and the wealthy, and she's saying God is going to raise up the poor. And it's like, wow, okay, I mean, this woman, who's comes out of nowhere, right? She's not really significant. She's not super wealthy or important, but then she's chosen by God because of her devotion and her faithfulness. And then she just opens her mouth and wow, she's writing scripture pretty much there. Mary Magdalene, okay, is also an important disciple. Mary, the sister of Martha, is portrayed even as a disciple. What is a disciple? A disciple is somebody who learns. And what does Mary, the sister of Martha, do? She's there learning at the feet of Jesus, and she's even praised for her devotion. Okay, when she sort of should be doing women's work, right? This kind of domestic work, kind of taking care of the men and preparing the house. She's there being a disciple and learning at Jesus' feet, and Jesus says, she's found the greater thing, and I'm not going to take that away from her. Okay, so Jesus honors these women, not just the narrative, but Jesus actually uplifts and honors these women. In chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, several women are mentioned by name as, again, following Jesus alongside the 12, right? The 12 disciples. And alongside them are these women mentioned by name. Again, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, and it says many others. Not only are they following Jesus, it says they supported Jesus and the disciples out of their resources. Okay, so they're actually like patrons. They're supporting this ministry, where we actually get the sense that like Jesus's ministry could not have succeeded without the support of these women who are following them alongside the 12 disciples. Right? It's women who preach about the resurrection to the disciples. Luke's account of Jesus' life and the way that Jesus related to women, the way that women figure in his life, it's one of the reasons why I am such a strong supporter of women in ministry. I always will be, and I always think that we need women to be in ministry. We need women to be pastors. We need women as church leaders. Luke's gospel is clear. The message of Jesus applies equally to both men and women. And more than that, we need all hands on deck doing the work of the gospel. In fact, women have special gifts and callings that the people of Christ need. Okay, you think of the Ave Maria in at the beginning of Luke's account, where Elizabeth calls out to Mary, and then she gives this song, and you think of the language there in that song, Hail Mary, the Lord is with you. Blessed be the fruit of your womb. I mean, this is really strongly gendered language, right? Blessed are you, and blessed is the fruit of your womb, Jesus. Okay, again, strongly gendered, feminine language, okay, and calling to our attention. God chose a woman. God chose, a woman's womb to nurture the Son of God. Okay, this story would not be the story that we have without women, without that specifically feminine nature to the story. Okay, no one is excluded from the gospel. Nobody is a second-class citizen in God's kingdom, according to Luke's vision. And way too often, we really downplay that feminine side. We really kind of, a lot of churches explicitly, fortunately our church explicitly, excludes women from leadership and ordination roles. Okay, so, but that's completely contrary to what we see in this third gospel. All right, having said that, now, as mentioned before, Luke's sort of inclusive vision is especially concerned with the poor. Okay, Luke devotes more of Jesus' teaching to this than pretty much anything. Okay, like nowhere else in the Gospels, Luke both encourages and expresses concern for the poor. But then not only that, because Jesus does that in the other Gospels too, right? Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Okay, the other Gospels, Jesus is teaching to the poor and saying the poor are favored by God. But in Luke's Gospel, not only are the poor blessed and favored, it's that the rich are cursed. Okay, and God turns his face to the poor and turns away from the wealthy. Jesus and Luke both have just some fearless takedowns of the wealthy and the powerful, right? Before Jesus is even born in this Magnificat, Mary, the mother of Jesus, sings a song of praise to God, and in that she declares, God has filled the hungry with good things and has sent the rich away empty. In Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, again, blessed are the poor in spirit, but in the corresponding passage in Luke, where Jesus doesn't speak from a mountain, but Jesus preaches on a plain to the crowds, Jesus says, blessed are the poor, there in Luke chapter 6, verse 20. But then a few verses later, woe to you who are rich. In the parables of the rich fool, there in chapter 12, and then the rich man and Lazarus in chapter 16, we have being wealthy is portrayed actually as a threat to one's eternal salvation. Okay, this is serious business, right? The rich man and the rich man and Lazarus, he kind of ignored this beggar outside of his gate, but it doesn't say that he really did anything else really bad, but it's actually the fact that he was rich, and when he's talking to God, sort of he's in hell, and this beggar Lazarus is with God in heaven. The reason why he's in hell is because Lazarus had nothing on earth and he had everything. And then in the afterlife, things are just reversed. Okay, it actually comes out like it's not about, well, if you're wealthy, you should use your money for good things. No, Luke says straight up, wealth is a threat to your salvation. According to the picture of Jesus we get from Luke, money and wealth are not morally neutral. They are dangerous. And and if you go along with pursuing wealth, if your life is about making money and you get rich in this world, your soul is in danger, Luke says. In fact, those who are faithful to God, Luke says they will give away their material possessions. Several times Jesus says this. And it is the poor who will be favored and blessed in the kingdom of heaven. In chapter 14, verses 15 through 24, Jesus outright says this. Okay, the kingdom of heaven belongs to the poor. Now this is, I mean, we gloss it over, right? And we say, oh, Luke's message is so beautiful and Luke includes everybody. But really, when you read through all of these passages and you just over and over, blessed are the poor, woe to you who are rich. This is a really strong broadside against what we have been raised in as modern American Christians. Okay, I'll be straight up with you, right? Here in America, wealth and comfort are seen as blessings. If you're favored by God, if you live the right way, if you do what God wants, you will be blessed, and you'll live comfortably. And you'll have the house, the white picket fence, the 2.5 kids, the cat and dog, okay, beautiful spouse, good job. Prosperity has been elevated to the level of a virtue to be pursued. All right, this is kind of the American idol, and repeatedly in the Bible it says this is a false god. Okay, but here in Luke especially, this is pledging allegiance to the spirit of the age. This is just as real a threat as any unclean spirits or demonic possession. Wealth and prosperity will separate you from the kingdom of heaven. And in fact, it makes us enemies of the gospel. And so if you are wealthy, you need to really be careful. And if you are pursuing wealth and you think that's the answer, you need to be careful. All right. Not only are you going to be an enemy of the gospel here, again, that wealth, that money is a threat to your salvation. All right. Just as surely as people need to get delivered from demons, people need to get delivered from this devotion to their wealth. It is a hard teaching, but it is something that we desperately need to hear. All right. Finally. Last thing that I wanted to talk about, there is this kind of way that Luke writes. Okay, the largest section of Luke is this final journey to Jerusalem. It starts in Luke 9, verse 51. It mentions that Jesus went up to go to Jerusalem, and then it ends with Jesus arriving there in chapter 19, verse 27. In this last journey to Jerusalem, this is where Luke concentrates all of Jesus' teaching ministry. And it's almost like the disciples, and then by extension us as readers, we are walking alongside Jesus, right? Kind of learning on the road, so to speak. The Christian life to Luke is a journey with Jesus. And to Luke, the longer you are on that journey, the more you will become like Jesus. But this is not just a spiritual transformation preparing us for a salvation to come. No, according to Luke's gospel, Christians should be experiencing the effects of salvation in the present. And then if we do have this salvation, we need to be working to liberate others to experience that same salvation. Okay, poverty, oppression, exclusion, again, these are all in opposition to the kingdom of heaven. And when you have freedom in Christ, it means renouncing every form of tribalism, nationalism, exceptionalism. Okay, even it means freedom from, again, the demands of wealth and success. So, in conclusion, for all of the elegance and beauty and artistry of the Gospel of Luke, it really comes down to this call to follow Christ, and the call is uncompromising and it is difficult. But for those who do answer the call to journey with Jesus, Luke says, the journey ends in heaven and life eternal. Not only that, it will change the way you live your life here on earth. and you will experience salvation and freedom right now. All right. I hope this has kind of inspired you to take that journey with Jesus through the Gospel of Luke, and best wishes as you do take this journey. And as we have our minds, our value systems challenged by this Jesus in Luke. All right. Blessings, everyone. Stay safe and healthy. And I'm praying for all of us. Our pastoral staff is praying for you as well. Blessings, and we'll see you next time. I'm going to put some links at the end here so that you can see our services on the weekend, as well as some ways that you can connect with our church as well. All right, see you next time.